What happens when we examine racism, not simply as a matter of personal attitudes, but as a historical and structural reality? Drawing on the work of Black Catholic writers and theologians, this episode explores some of the questions I've been wrestling with and where that learning has led me so far. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast exploring Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology. I'm Max Kuzma, a transgender man and columnist for the National Catholic Reporter and a board member of Dignity USA. Thank you to the paid Substack subscribers who make this work possible. So before we get too much into this topic, I kind of want to, give a little note about the lay of the land and, some of the limitations of this episode as well. This episode will not feature any Black Catholic voices directly. That's a limitation for sure and not a virtue. I do have future conversations for this podcast planned with Black Catholics, and I hope that those episodes will bring perspectives that I simply cannot provide. So my goal here today is much more modest, just to reflect on my own learning process and to take stock of where that learning has led me thus far. Partially because I think that, at least when I was, starting to dig into this topic more, there, were a lot of emotions and feelings as a white person of like, okay, how do I engage with this topic? How do I get started? So my hope is with this episode to kind of show a way that you could do that too, a place to start. And like I said, it's not going to be the definitive, version of this because it can't be that, this is just my perspective. But I will be sharing resources, that are directly from the Black community that I have learned a lot from and encourage other people to learn from too. A lot of this started for me, like this exploration of this topic started because I have been long aware that my understanding of the Black Catholic experience has been very limited. And as I started to ask, okay, in what ways is this limited? What ways can I learn more? Like, how can I approach this topic to become educated? What I started with, the place that I began was realizing that my understanding of the Catholic reaction, the Catholic perspective, and even the Catholic history when it comes to the Black community was incomplete. So like a lot of white Catholics, I was always taught that racism was wrong. And honestly, I think I just believed that like the church was always against racism. Or like always against slavery. Like, I think I just believed that the church was just always on the right side of things, which is very naive and also just very detached from like the reality of history because like, most institutions, like there's an institutional element going on here where all the major institutions that existed were kind of complicit in slavery. Not to say that the church, that gives it an exemption or something like that, but just, I think I was just detached from this idea of not realizing that the church really did actively participate in certain things. So for example, there are papal bulls, which I think is a type of letter, that basically, told the rulers of Spain and Portugal, which were both Catholic countries, basically that they had a right to go take slaves in the New World. So there's also obviously deep histories of colonialization and the way that mentality, this colonizing mentality, which I honestly think there's so much there, even before we get to the treatment of Black people and even before we get to the slavery of Black people in America, just the fact that, the America that we know comes from this manifest destiny, exploration. I'm going to find and take and transform what I find into what I want it to be. I'm going to, find what resources are there. Like that's a really interesting thing about the history when it comes to Spain and Portugal, was this whole idea that they were going to find all this gold in South America, which I'm I don't know much about that, and I would love to know why they were that they believed that that's what was going to happen. There's also the whole thing about the Fountain of Youth. There's a lot of rabbit holes here. That's another thing. And so again, be patient with me. Again, this is not like any type of final word. I'm just kind of filling in for you the things that I have thought about this topic, and how I've looked at it. But yeah, so returning back to this idea of the Catholic Church specifically, I definitely was not taught in any meaningful way about the history of Catholic involvement in slavery, or even the development of Black Catholic thought, or the ways that Black Catholics have challenged the Church to live more fully into its own professed commitments to human dignity and justice. In reading Black Catholic journalists, like, for current breaking events, the Black Catholic Messenger is a great website. They provide a lot of articles on all types of things that are happening in the news right now. And then also historians and theologians. I encountered not only new information, but also new analytical frameworks that have been really, really helpful. Different ways of understanding the relationships between some of these topics, like faith, race, power, history, and social structures. These frameworks have challenged many of my assumptions and expanded my understanding of both the Catholic Church and American society and the Black Catholic experience. That was 3 things, not 2. And so for this episode, there's kind of 3 parts. First, I will talk about the questions and experiences and thoughts that prompted, some of this inquiry. Then I will share some of what I've learned from Black Catholic writers and thinkers, particularly through the work of Alessandra Harris, who wrote In the Shadow of Freedom, and Father Bryan Massingale, who wrote Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. And we'll lightly touch on James Cone, the Black liberation theologian. I haven't finished reading much of his work yet, but he is one of the most cited across all of these, and I think is really critical. And what I have read of his book so far, one of his books is really good. So we'll include him. And then third and finally, I will offer some tentative conclusions about my perspective on what I've learned and what I think this reveals about the Church's past, its present challenges, and the responsibilities that fall, especially upon white Catholics. So I think I've given you enough disclaimers at this point, that, again, this is not a comprehensive account of the Black Catholic experience, and I'm not trying to speak on behalf of Black Catholics. Rather, I'm just externalizing and making visible my own learning process to identify and reveal some of the gaps in my previous understanding, and to consider what might be required if Catholics are serious about confronting racial injustice, not merely as individual moral failure, but as a structural and ecclesial reality. Let's start with the first question. What is missing in my understanding about the Black Catholic experience? So, a lot. And I think for this part, this is something that I appreciated in Father Bryan Massingale's book, is that he talked about how there are the way that white Catholics, white people think about race often has unconscious elements, and there can be a lot of different emotions going on. So I would just say for myself, I was aware that I live and exist in a system that has structural inequalities. A lot of that came from just as being as becoming a member of a marginalized community as a trans person. That, I think, really started to open up my understanding of justice and injustices within like structural systems, because in the way that I grew up, it was very insulated and the world was presented a certain way. In a lot of different aspects are included in that. That includes things like, you know, there was an assumption about things like education and employment. If you go to college, then you will be able to get a good job and you'll stay with the company for like, your whole career, and then you'll retire and they'll take care of you. Like those types of things as well were kind of included in this worldview. Um, I think, I definitely, I definitely was raised in an environment where racism was acknowledged as a reality, but it was not grappled with as a structural problem. And it was not, I think there's an important part here too, where it's like, I don't know, I kind of feel like, I know that like a lot of the way that the history is taught is like, this happened, and then the Civil War was fought about it, and then slavery was abolished. And like, even though there's still acknowledgement of like segregation era Jim Crow, it's almost taught in such a way that the chapter was closed. And so that's not really something we worry about in the same way. Of course, then we also had a Black president, which I think, again, kind of spoke to this idea that like the racism issue is like closed. Like I really think I grew up in kind of where that was in the air. Like, yeah, we're this multicultural, we're like diverse, like this, which I understand now is not reflective of the reality that so many Black people have experienced this whole time, because the structural inequalities didn't just magically go away. But I'm trying to paint the picture of like where I was coming from. Yeah. And so then for me, once I started wrestling with my trans identity, that was a moment when I really had to think critically about basically all of the aspects of the worldview I was presented with, because one of the major parts of that worldview is that there's only men and women, and that's it, right? And that those are the only two options, and that you can only have vocational choices if you are a cisgender man or a cisgender woman and heterosexual. And so when I started to like think deeply about all this, and think about, okay, so what if I am able to have the experience of being trans? Like, if it is possible that I am trans, this challenges the central part of this worldview. And so if that's being challenged, what else can be challenged, right? And that's when I started to really learn. I learned that being trans is not one thing. And I think that is honestly one of the things that the dominant culture feels threatened by when it comes to trans people, is that it's really not just one thing. This idea of cisgender heterosexual, you are the gender you were assigned at birth, you're attracted to the opposite gender. It's very simple, right? It's very binary. It's like, there's, if I can boil this down to just these two options, then it's more efficient, then it's more easier to process, easier to understand, things like that, right? Whereas with the trans experience, it can be so many different things, because when you transition, it just means that you're transitioning. It's not saying you will have a binary transition. It's not saying that your sexuality is going to like quote unquote match the default assumptions or norms. Like, it's a much more expansive thing. And in the pursuit of learning more about the trans experience broadly, because now I was, now it was a completely new world. So I was like, okay, well, what is there to know about this? That's when I encountered all of the science, and I was like, okay, so literally every major scientific organization believes that being trans is a real thing, and that treating dysphoria with medical treatments is the way to alleviate the discomfort and the pain of gender dysphoria and gender incongruence. Like, okay, I got the science. And then I also started to learn more about the way that trans people are treated in society. Because again, I already knew it was like a little bit forbidden and stigmatized in my world, but I also knew that my version of the world was not the whole world. And so prior that would have been like, okay, we have this secret special world, and now it was okay. What did I not have the opportunity to learn and understand about the world because of being in this little bubble? And so that's where I started to learn about like the layers of marginalization in like an intersectional reality for trans people. I learned about the violence that transgender people experience, particularly Black transgender women, but also like any homeless transgender people, which this overlaps as well with homeless gay children, right? Like if somebody is kicked out of their house for being gay or for being trans, they're going to face, statistically, you don't have that safety net, you don't have that home base. You're going to face more structural pain, more structural issues. You get what I mean? And so then in that process, that really revealed to me how much that I didn't know. And when I was starting in there, I had to focus on what I was going through at that moment because it was what I was going through. It's like I had all these years of repression and stuff that came knocking at the door and, exploded. And now suddenly I'm like, okay, I need to process and understand what I'm going through and get myself in order. And as I was doing that, I started to learn as well what I wanted to make my masculinity about. And I was very aware of the privileged transition part of it. I was very aware that my voice would be taking on different weight as I became more passable as just male in society. I knew that would mean different types of scrutiny, different types of attention, different types of interactions. I was aware that was going to happen. And so as part of that, I had to reckon with, what do I want to do with that change? Like when I am deferred to in a situation, what am I going to do? And that's where I really was intentional from the beginning in thinking about, it's really important to me that I use that opportunity to uplift those other voices, because the only way that we're ever going to learn from, hear from other perspectives is if we use our positions of whatever privilege we have, whatever authority we have, whatever position we have, if we use that position not to gatekeep or to keep people out, but to uplift and learn from and listen. And so that definitely was a value from the beginning. But I think there was definitely still throughout this time, I definitely just felt like I was an outsider to the experiences of like the Black community. And so I think it made me feel like I didn't have the right to want to interact or learn more or whatever the case may be. Like, yeah, but ultimately I think that was like a self-inflicted thing, right? Because, and also like a way of avoiding doing the work, because like if I'm like, oh, well, I'm already an outsider to this community. I don't know what I don't know, but I also don't know how to find out what I don't know. There's like a self-inflicted helplessness there. And so, I also do think, though, there's also like an overwhelming angle, because when I started to think about like, how will I approach learning more about this area that I know that I don't know enough about, I think it was like overwhelming because what approach to take, and then how do you know if you're learning if you're learning the right things, because ultimately there are barriers, right? Like, I'm never going to have the Black experience, and so I'm never going to be able to know it in that way. But like, that's why I'm kind of setting this up by telling you about how I interrogated through my trans experience this idea of privilege, because I think that's what it really comes down to. Is I think that it's about how do I learn how to use my position, again, whatever that position is, to on behalf of marginalized people. Like, what is the most effective way to advocate for marginalized people from the position that I am in? Yes. And so as a trans person, once again, like, a lot of my advocacy goes into talking about the trans experience, because it is the area that I do have expertise about being trans, because that is my actual lived experience, right? But that doesn't mean that I can't also advocate for other issues and other people's. So as I really started to think about this more, I realized that for me, because so much of the advocacy work that I'm already doing is within Catholicism, that looking at this topic, the Black Catholic experience, would be a what's the word I'm looking for? This would be a natural entry point for me. And it would connect naturally to my other work, because that is something that has been really cool and meaningful to me, profound to me, is to read the accounts of Black Catholics and feel a sense of solidarity with what they're describing about what it feels like to be a marginalized community within Catholicism. Yeah, so basically that's my whole background of how I got to this topic, and also about how I decided to approach it. Because I think that's really important background, just to set the stage, right? Because we're all going to come at it from different perspectives, and I think when you think about what your own position in society is, it can potentially reveal to you ways that you can learn more, or get involved more in different ways. Because that's another thing too. I live in an incredibly rural area, on a farm, and so I don't have like local organizations that I can just go to get involved in certain ways, right? So that's just some background about like how I got to this point. So now we'll go to part two. And part two is basically more about what I've learned. And, again, disclaimer, I know this is incomplete, but this is kind of what I'm working with so far. So I mentioned earlier an easy resource that I think a lot of Catholics can get involved with right away, which is one thing I really like about it. It's very accessible, is the Black Catholic Messenger. They have a website. They're on social media. I often see their posts on Facebook or on Instagram, and then I go to their website and read what they've written about. Or, when breaking news happens, I tend that I think they'll have a perspective on, I tend to go there right away, check their website. Yeah, I think that was a really accessible and important entry point. One of the first articles that I read from the Black Catholic Messenger was about a church in Colorado that basically threw out a bunch of Black hymnals. And I thought this was shocking, but also it was just a very clear example to me of like, this just isn't Catholic, because the whole point of Catholicism is that it's supposed to be able to encompass all of these different cultures and peoples. Like, I mean, I grew up hearing about how, like, the church in Africa, the Catholic Church in Africa, is going to have a very different way of celebrating Mass than the church in the US, right? And like, or even, even more so like a Eurocentric idea of how we practice church, like celebrate church. Um, and the hymnals thing, like, it was just so overt. And I think that, yeah, as well, within the context, when I was kind of laying out the history, obviously right now as well, in this backlash to having a black president of Obama, like, we are we are seeing structural racism ramped up, especially as it relates to people who are perceived to, quote, not be from here. This whole idea of immigration and who really belongs in this country. So there's a lot of that going on in all of this too. But yeah, that moment with the hymnals really stood out to me, especially because it's like there was just an assumption there, right, that this is not authentically Catholic enough for our idea of what Catholic is. And it just threw out and failed to acknowledge what was actually there. There wasn't an actual engagement with these hymns to actually know what was put into them. Like, yeah, it's just this assumption that the white Catholic experience, Eurocentric as well, is the default, and that, of course, these hymnals must not be appropriate, right, for mass. Like, just so much was in that assumption. And the Black Catholic Messenger had a really great article about it that kind of dug into what was actually in those specific hymnals that they threw out. And I just thought, yeah, like, why can't we honor and respect and want to know those histories? Like, why is this just being reduced to, well, this doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lack of engagement there, very intentional, just throwing out the hymnals. There's not the interaction. Another thing that struck me about that incident was I posted, like, I don't know, some short reels about it. And, there weren't that many people who interacted with them, but there were people who literally in the comments were like, I am a white Christian nationalist, or white nationalist, or white supremacist. Like, they just came into those comments and said, good, I'm a white nationalist and this is what I agree with, which I thought was insane. It's a very odd to have grown up in a time when, like, you can't say the thing, you can't spell it out. Again, we know that there has been an ongoing issue of structural inequality, but racism itself, in this overt, articulated way, was frowned upon for quite some time in this, again, external way. And yet now they're just back to just spelling it out directly in a comment. So again, I know this isn't shocking, but, like, for me, it was very clear that these people are unwilling to actually engage with the content and are just bypassing it because of a belief system, right? And honestly, I think it's a belief system that they're not interrogating. And that's what I feel like I learned a lot from with Bryan Massingale's book. One of the main points of the book, which I think is so urgently important even now, even though this book was published in 2015, is this idea that so often how we approach racism, how we talk about it, is from the idea of the personal and the individual sin, not the structural mechanisms. So a lot of it is, well, it's wrong to be racist. And if we just sit down people who are saying racist things and rationally explain to them why racism is wrong, we can change their minds. And it's like, okay, there's a few things wrong with that, because first of all, it is a structural problem whereby the systems that first were slavery have slowly morphed into other forms. So we had slavery that was supposed to be abolished, but then we had segregation in the Jim Crow era that was supposed to be abolished, but then we had mass incarceration, which disproportionately affects the Black community. That's still ongoing, and that's also been ramped up with in regards to the topic of immigration. And then there's all these other things too, like the war on drugs. Even though Black and white people use drugs at like the same rates, the Black community was specifically focused on and punished and incarcerated at a much higher rate for that. There's also the issues of like housing discrimination, employment discrimination. There's still the fact that these preferences exist. And then even now, especially today, with the purposeful destruction of some structural supports, most notably the attack on DEI, right? When Charlie Kirk said something like, if I see a black pilot in an airplane, I'm going to be nervous, as if the idea that like that person did not have to work as hard to get that position because of DEI. This is the argument, right? Like basically DEI is just like a free pass to positions of authority that is unearned. That's the argument that they make, which is so flawed in so many ways, because the idea with DEI was not to do that. The idea was there are structural barriers, and so DEI is an opportunity to be in a conversation about like a job position or whatever the case may be, or have the opportunity to get a scholarship at college, for example, or anything that you wouldn't be able to access otherwise, like setting aside some of the resources that we have for a well-deserving individual. And that's the thing, is like you look at the people who actually, you look at that black pilot, for example, in all likelihood he's had to work harder in many, many ways than his white peers, even to be considered for that slot. That's a really important thing. It's not like, oh, we have a slot for a black pilot, so we're just going to find any black person. No, it's all of the black pilots who are working to, get certified or whatever they have to do are going to be applying for that. And so the competition will be high. And so the quality of that person's skills is going to be high. Like, but this is one of the whole DEI thing is just an example of there's not a coherent argument there. And it's also the type of thing where as soon as that argument is no longer beneficial to the people making it, they're just going to move on to the next one. So I don't always feel like there's that much point in spending a lot of time on like correcting them in that way, in an individual way, because we know that those people aren't going to take in any of that information. Obviously, it needs to be clear that DEI is important, and it is a system that will uplift deserving people, period. I've even seen some things that in the aftermath of this attack on DEI, that white men have been suffering from it as well. And it's like, yeah, because the whole point is that there are people who face structural barriers in many different ways. There are poor white people who need the opportunity of something like DEI as well. Anyway, yeah, a little bit of a tangent there, but yes. So I got off on that tangent because I was trying to articulate this idea of what some of these structural things are, and how if we are just focusing on individual behavior, we're missing some of the dynamic realities that are ongoing that Black people and people of color have to figure out how to mediate on a daily basis. It's it's still, it's still, I still read, and I've been ever since I got on the internet, when I was in high school or whatever, until now, I have been reading accounts of being black while driving and getting pulled over for literally no reason, and knowing how quickly that can escalate and knowing how dangerous that can be. And that's like a structural thing, because that doesn't happen to me. You know what I mean? Um, just the structural idea that being black makes you more likely to be, I don't know, that makes you more likely to be doing something wrong in the eyes of those with power and authority. Um, and so, kind of relating this back to Catholicism again, some other stuff that I learned a lot from Alessandra's book, In the Shadow of Freedom. And I plan to have her on the show soon. So she will be able to speak more eloquently and in more depth about everything that, everything that her work covers. But I will just speak a little bit about what I got out of the book. I think the biggest thing was an understanding of the Catholic Church's participation in and role in slavery, and the fact that it took so long for the church to, I guess, make any statements against slavery. And then if we, in Bryan Massingale's book, I like that he digs into some of the documents that were put out, and again shows that the documents against racism were largely, again, personal. Alessandra's book is really good as well, because she devotes a chapter to kind of each of the phases of how the systemic inequalities have developed. So she has the beginning about slavery. She has the Jim Crow and the segregation. She has mass incarceration, the war on drugs. She has a great chapter on, I believe that chapter is called From Subhuman to Super Predator. And it's again about this idea of how Black people and Black men in particular are viewed and characterized throughout history. And it's a really excellent book. Something that stood out to me from both of these two books is this thing called the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission was an 11-person committee that was put together by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967. And basically the idea of that commission was to make a study of the situation of Black people in America and basically make recommendations. And this commission was actually really well done. The actual commission itself. They talked to all the people, they got all the statistics, they got all the data. They looked at the structural issues that were facing Black people, especially around employment, poverty, and housing. And as a sidebar, I'll just say that's something that I think that's something that's woken me up a bit in regards to this topic, is like, again, when you have this idea of this dominant culture, oh yeah, like I'm just used to the fact that the most impoverished neighborhoods in most major cities, most major areas are the Black community. I'm just used to that, right? Like this is just the world I'm used to. And starting to interrogate that and say, well, hold on a minute, like that is a structural problem we could solve. And that's kind of what the Kerner Commission looked at. They looked at like, how could we actually solve this? And they made concrete recommendations, which I don't have those all memorized right now, but I do know it involved setting aside a substantial amount of money that would be used to address some of these issues, right? Well, what happened was it was not what the president wanted to hear. It didn't align with the narrative that he had in his mind, which was much more about basically this idea that that there was an excuse for why Black people are facing structural issues, and that excuse was, well, it's just because Black families aren't strong enough and Black fathers are like not good fathers and they don't want to care about their children. They just want to go off and do all these things. Okay, that's like such a generalization. And again, there's no data for that. So he ignored the data from the commission that he established, and then put that money critically into policing. So basically into ways of perpetuating the problem rather than actually addressing it. Now, what I find really fascinating about the Kerner Commission is the fact that the Catholic Church was actually really, the U.S. bishops specifically, were really impacted by that commission. They were more spurred to movement by that than they had been previously, because there had been, I believe, 2 previous documents that they had put out on the topic of racism. But after the Kerner Commission, they put out what I think what Massingale would characterize as their strongest in 1979. It's called Brothers and Sisters to Us, I believe. And I really liked in the book, he was like, you know, first of all, the framing of this, like the implication that, again, brothers and sisters to us, who is us? Like the us is the white dominant culture. But yeah, the bishops were moved by it more than, I guess, other things that had happened. And they laid out their most strongly worded document about the topic. So I think that's really interesting. And because I think one of the things that fascinates me most about American Catholicism is I find it really interesting to look at why does the American Catholic Church do the things that it does? Because that's something that Massingale also talked about, is that at times, many times, the church in Rome was out of step with the American Catholic Church on the issue of racism, where you'd have popes who would be saying or doing more, or at least, again, just saying anything, because that's the biggest thing, is that the U.S. bishops were just so quiet as a whole body in general about the topic. But you had Pope John Paul II, who was talking about racism and characterizing it as a big problem. Of course, again, fast forwarding, we've had Pope Francis and now Pope Leo in his latest encyclical Magnificat Humanitas actually spelled out an apology in that encyclical document, which for slavery, for the church's role in slavery, which is a really big deal. But also, again, this is one of those things where it's like, did it really have to take this long for us to say this? I don't know. Like, I think that, yeah, I think the whole concept of the idea of, let's focus on this as if it's a personal failing that we can correct in individual people, rather than how is this a systemic issue? I think that's the key. And I think, as Massingale points out, a lot of the resistance to looking at it in a structural way has to do with what will change if we look at it in a structural way. And what will change if we look at it in a structural way is that it will require us to involve ourselves in the lives of Black Catholics in a way that we haven't done. Which means listening and seeking out, seeking to know what they want to share. And then also it will require learning from them in a leadership capacity. It will require saying, hey, you guys are the experts of your own experience. What happens when we give you the authority to share that with us? And that is very threatening and challenging to this whole American project of, that we have a certain dominant culture here. And I really think there's a strong argument to be made about how much the American Catholic Church wants to assimilate itself into that dominant culture. I think that's how you get to the point of MAGA Catholicism. That's how you get to the point of these recent reports that Pope Leo has lost popularity among Republicans. They don't like that he condemned slavery and AI. They don't like that he is not their culture warrior pope. That's definitely it. And they failed to successfully lobby. There were reports that there were like Napa Valley Catholics who were ready to pour a bunch of money into, I guess, influencing is the only way to say it, the outcome of the conclave. To which I say, good luck with that. Didn't work out for you. I'm sorry to say. I'm actually happy to say, but had to sass them a little bit. Okay, let's wrap this up with part 3, which is kind of, I guess, my conclusions. I've kind of already been telling you some of them as we go, so I think that my main conclusions are about, it's just really upsetting, and what the lack of action from the Catholic Church in regards to this topic, the lack of a willingness to feature, promote, and have that leadership component I was talking about. And also, it's really disappointing, this idea of focusing on the individual acts of racism as opposed to the structural issues, especially in light of the fact that the church, and Massingale talks about this a lot, which I appreciated, the church has within it the social teaching, the social doctrine, and the methodology for uplifting and really highlighting and understanding the most marginalized. Like, that is right in the theology. So the question becomes, why are we not like living out that theology, right? And this is kind of, I don't know. I thought a lot about, in this part, I thought a lot about, again, some of the queer experience, which feels very similar, where the actual voices of people from the LGBTQ community, like the lived experience piece, is not being listened to. And it is not, and LGBTQ people are not given the opportunity to be leaders. I had a conversation on this podcast with Sister Louisa that you may have listened to. She's done ministry with trans people for over 20 years. And she talked about how there's often an attitude in the past, there has been, towards like trans people, for example, like when Pope Francis was taking care of providing medicine and stuff for the trans sex workers in Rome during COVID, there's a perception that, you know, that's doing a good deed because those are like bad people, right? Those are sinful people. And I think there's a lot of that attitude when it comes to marginalized communities in general within the Catholic Church. Like, because of this idea of it's not structural, it's individual, then if an individual does any particular, like, quote unquote, you know, good act, good deed, then you've just solved the problem, because you have done something nice for these people that are suffering, but, you know, that suffering is kind of like within a vacuum. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, okay, so when can we start to look at and realize what is actually here? You know, when can we actually acknowledge reality? When are we going to be willing to be brave enough to engage in conversations that are difficult? When are we going to be brave enough to learn histories that are extremely painful? You know what I mean? Like, these are like the real questions. And honestly, that's also kind of where the liberation stuff comes in, because it's so interesting. I was thinking the other day about the word liberation and how liberation theology is kind of a boogeyman within the Catholic world, because it's associated with Marxism, which is associated with communism, which is seen as evil because of totalitarian regimes that took over the principles of communism, but didn't actually ever practice it in a way that would be actually ethical. There's a lot there, I think, to unpack, but it's interesting to me that the word liberation itself is so, I guess, stigmatized and scary for some people, because the word liberation and the word freedom, right? So what's the difference between those two? And why is it that freedom is okay? Freedom and liberation are pretty close. They are doing different things, but they're pretty close. So what is so scary about liberation that's not scary about freedom? Maybe again, it's this idea of a personal freedom versus liberation as thinking beyond systems that benefit some people more than they benefit others. And that's threatening. That's just threatening, period. But yeah, so I think that as it relates to the Catholic Church as well, I think, again, my biggest takeaway is I think I really just feel that the U.S. Catholic Church is out of touch with, out of step with what Catholicism can be when Catholicism is at its best, and is also to a large degree out of touch with the Pope. I mean, if Republicans view the Pope so negatively, like, this just speaks to the fact that in America, a partisan, polarized environment is seen as normal. And the idea of having bigger questions or looking at a bigger picture is so challenging. Like the fact that the global Catholic Church, the Church of Rome, Pope Leo as Pope of the world, not just Pope of America, the fact that feels like there's some tension there, I feel like is very, just illustrates the problem. And so, yeah, I mentioned James H. Cone. He's a Black liberation theologian. And I think as well that after learning all of the history, which I think is the really important foundational part, especially because, again, there's such a feeling in as a white person, there was such a feeling of, like, shame and embarrassment about this thing, but also, like, it wasn't me. So, like, there's just, like, a weird dynamic there. And so just, like, learning it and hearing it from Black people and, like, knowing this is what it was, takes away that power of, like, being uncomfortable with it. Now I just know what it is. So there's that piece. But then I think as well, the spirituality piece is a really big deal, because I think that, first of all, I know that the spirituality that Black people and Black Catholics had to develop in order to survive, and in order to I don't know if this is the right word, but metabolize the things that they have been through, and that their ancestors have been through, that is going to be a very robust spirituality. It's going to be a spirituality that anybody can learn from and that can be valuable to anybody. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there as well. So I don't think we have to just view the idea of including people who have been systematically excluded. We don't have to just view that as a challenge to the power and authority that has been enjoyed, but we can also view it as an opportunity to learn and integrate things that we haven't been able to do ourselves. Like, I don't think it's going to, like, be a case of let's topple everything and destroy everything. I think it's, what does a more just world look like for everybody? I know that when I talk about the trans experience, I really like to talk about the spirituality component for similar reasons, which is that within the experience of marginalization, there is a closeness to the gospel. There's a closeness to Jesus, who was with the most oppressed and marginalized people. And so there is a perspective and a depth that is available that is beneficial to all people, even if you don't share the identity or the experience of the person who is revealing that dynamic of spirituality. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about spirituality, is that it is not uniform, because God did create this diverse world, and in doing so did not intend for structural systems that systematically oppress some people. Like, Jesus literally lived in a time when there was structural oppression of people, and he literally chose to spend his time with those people. There's a image in Massingale's book of the welcome table that he talks about as a important image and symbol within the Black community that is connected to the Eucharistic table, the table that is normally in a social context seen as a place of hierarchy. Who's going to sit at my right and my left? Who's the most important guest or whatever? And how Jesus consistently overturns that understanding and always makes the table a place of welcome for all. And what does that look like? And how do we live that out? So thank you for joining me today as I shared with you some of my developing thoughts. Again, look for more programming that includes Black Catholic voices. I'm really excited to work on this and bring this to you. I think it's a really important and it's a great opportunity for all of us to learn more ways to be connected to and understand and learn from these experiences, these lived experiences, these histories, these theologies. There's so much there for all of us to get something out of. And so I'm excited to bring that to you soon. And thanks again.